welcome to week 1 of Worth It. The big idea that we're going to be talking about in the next couple weeks is that the Jesus who suffered suffers with you. All right. So I want to share with you a couple Easter traditions that I remember growing up. One of them was that every Easter morning after church, my parents, the Easter Bunny would hide an Easter basket. And what I remember about my Easter basket is that every year I got a coconut in my Easter basket. There was other stuff in there too. There was, candy and some other goodies and surprises. But what I remember specifically was a coconut. And I got a coconut every year in my Easter basket. My sister got a pineapple. My brothers, I believe, got bananas. So it just kind of something neat that stuck with me and I remember. The other thing that I remember is my family was, we were Lutheran, but we were also celebrating Greek Orthodox tradition as my dad is Greek. So the Greek Orthodox tradition, well, first of all, Greek Easter often falls on a different Sunday than traditional Easter. So we would get to have 2 Easters, which was pretty cool. So for Greek Easter, we would always take the time to color Easter eggs, and those eggs were always colored red, a very dark, like blood red color. And that was to signify and remember Jesus' sacrifice. The red egg was a reminder of Jesus' blood. And then we would take those eggs when we were with our huge extended Greek family, and we would have an egg cracking contest. And whoever ended up with an egg that wasn't cracked was the winner. And I just remember it being tons and tons of fun. Well, chances are that you have some Easter traditions of your own. And maybe one of those is an Easter egg hunt, okay? What if you participated in an Easter egg hunt where plastic eggs were hidden with jelly beans in them? And some of the jelly beans that were in those eggs were those wonderful, delicious kind that tasted really, really good. And some of them were the Bean Boozled kind that tasted really gross. Okay, so if you got an egg full of gross jelly beans, how would you feel about the people who ate the delicious jelly beans? How do you feel about the people who ate the gross jelly beans along with you? Do you think you'd rather be comforted by someone who ate delicious jelly beans or gross jelly beans? Well, if someone were to give you some comfort or an encouraging prep talk about eating those disgusting jelly beans, I'm guessing that you'd rather be comforted by someone who knows how gross they are. We've all endured some pretty awful things in our life. And when you have to endure something awful, I've always found that comfort is more powerful when it comes from someone who knows what it's like. I don't know what kind of difficulty you've been experiencing this year. Maybe the most difficult most difficult thing you've experienced was a tough soccer practice, or a broken leg, or trying to eat an extra spicy chicken wing at B-Dubs. Maybe you've been walking through something much more difficult, like rejection, stress, disappointment, sickness, or maybe you're even grieving a loss. Or maybe the tough things that you're going through are pretty ordinary, but they're still exhausting, like trying to navigate friend drama, or get your grades up, or learn something new. Okay, when we're experiencing something difficult, sometimes the thing we need most is comfort from someone who understands what we're going through. When life gets hard, it's really easy for us to feel like we're all alone. Like we're the only ones who've ever experienced what we're experiencing. Oh, we might say to our parents, "You have no idea what I'm going through. You don't understand," right? Nobody could possibly understand what we're doing. But during these times, people will tell us that God is with us. Okay, but it can still feel like we're going through life all alone. Some of these times could be like when your friends turn their backs on you, or you don't make the team, or pass your driving test, or you don't get the job you wanted, or won that special award. Someone says something hurtful to you, or maybe your family is struggling. Right, when life is difficult, we might wonder, why would God let this happen? Should I just give up? Is it all worth it? This might come as a surprise to you, but even Jesus understands what it's like to ask these questions. Okay, if you've been around church before, you've probably heard that Jesus died and then rose from the dead a few days later. Pretty cool. That's what we celebrate every Easter Sunday. But before we talk about what happened after Jesus' death, his resurrection, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what happened before, because I think Jesus has something to show us about suffering. Here's a little summary of the book of Matthew, chapter 26. All right, it's 2 days before Passover, and Jesus announces that he's going to be handed over to be crucified. And he means really soon. He tells this to his disciples. And at that same time, the chief priests and the elders are conspiring about how they're going to arrest Jesus. Okay, they know they can't do it in daylight because people will riot, because Jesus has several followers. So they plan to arrest him at night. Well, while visiting Simon the leper, an unnamed woman anoints Jesus with these perfumes and oils. And believe it or not, the disciples are not really happy about it, right? That oil was really expensive, and she uses the entire bottle. And the disciples are thinking that oil could have been sold for money to help the poor. But not this time. Jesus says, "You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this anointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial." All right. Well, meanwhile, the chief priests find their inside man in Judas, right? One of Jesus' disciples. And they pay him 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. Jesus and his disciples gather together to celebrate Passover, all right? The Last Supper. This is what we celebrate on Maundy, Thursday. And Jesus drops the bomb that someone at the table is going to betray him. Of course, everyone starts denying it and asking everyone else, what's going on? Even Judas is denying it at this point. Well, pretty soon they start eating. Jesus gives them bread and wine, and he says that it's his body and blood. Not sure how appetizing that sounded at the time. But after dinner, they all head up to the Mount of Olives. Jesus quotes scripture and says that Peter will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. Peter's like, "No, that is never going to happen, Lord. I'm not going to deny you. I'm going to stick by you." All right, then they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him to pray. It's really late, and they're really tired, so the 3 disciples decide to take a little nap. Well, Jesus comes back, and he can't believe that they're sleeping. Okay, and as if doing it once weren't bad enough, they do it 2 more times. He goes away to pray, and they fall asleep. He goes away to pray, and they fall asleep. Finally, during this time of prayer in the garden, Judas comes and kisses Jesus. Now, you know what that means? That was the signal to the chief priests and elders that that's who they were going to arrest. It was time to arrest Jesus. Now, out of protection, one of the disciples draws a sword and cuts off the ear of a servant. Jesus tells him to put that sword away. So they take away Jesus, and he's taken to see Caiaphas, the high priest. Peter is following behind at kind of a safe distance. The chief priests try to find people to testify against Jesus, but they can't round anybody up. Okay, but 2 people come forward saying that Jesus claimed he could destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Okay, they think that's a good enough testimony. So they ask Jesus if he is the Son of God. Jesus replies that they have said so. And then he quotes scripture. All right, the high priests accuse him of blasphemy, and they begin to strike him and tease him. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Peter gets recognized by some of the people as being a friend with Jesus, but he denies it. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And you know what happens right after the 3rd denial? The rooster crows. Guess who remembered Jesus' prediction? Peter did. All right. Well, I'm going to come back to verses 36 and 39 that we have just talked about in Matthew 26. In this one chapter, Jesus is experiencing more suffering than most of us could probably imagine. Right? He said goodbye to his friends. He let everyone down that he loved. He was arrested. He was taken to trial. He was sentenced to death. He was spit upon, beaten, and betrayed by 2 of his closest friends. Right? We might imagine that Jesus walked toward death with complete peace and composure. But the account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane paints a little different picture. Listen to these verses from Matthew 26. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The Bible tells us that at this moment, during his prayers, Jesus was overwhelmed and he was in anguish and exhausted, right? Because he knew exactly what was about to happen. In the final hours before Jesus' death, we see him asking, "God, is there any other way?" If I were Jesus, I think I'd be asking another question too. "God, is this worth it?" Right? These people have betrayed me. They have forgotten about me. They've humiliated me, hurt me, and want to kill me. Are they really worth this pain? If I were Jesus, I think my answer would be no. Okay, Jesus not only suffered at this time, but many people in the first century suffered because of their faith in Jesus. All right, the Roman government was really threatened by Jesus' teachings and the movement that Jesus began, which meant that his followers endured all kinds of suffering and oppression. Naturally, this made the followers of Jesus wonder, is this really worth it? Many of Jesus' early followers were Jewish, okay, and while they were raised to follow the laws and beliefs of Judaism, they put their trust in Jesus and they began to follow him. But in the face of persecution, many of these Jewish Jesus followers considered going back to their old ways. That's where the book of Hebrews comes in. Hebrews was a book written as a letter to encourage these followers of Jesus who weren't sure that all their pain and suffering was worth it. The author tells these followers of Jesus to stay strong, to not drift away, and to remember that Jesus understands what it feels like to suffer. I want to read you some verses from Hebrews. "But we see him for a little while who was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." The writer tells us that Jesus is our great high priest, right? It's a Jewish concept that readers probably would have understand really well. In Judaism, a high priest was someone who made sacrifices to God when people messed up. Okay, someone who prayed to God on the people's behalf. But the writer says that Jesus is our new high priest. Jesus didn't just make sacrifices, he became a sacrifice on our behalf. Jesus gave up his own life to make a way for us to connect with God now and forever. Okay, to these Jewish Jesus followers who understood the importance of a high priest, this was a pretty convincing argument about why they should believe in Jesus. But they weren't struggling because they needed to be convinced that Jesus was God, but because life got really hard. So the writer of Hebrews pointed them back to Jesus, their Savior, who suffered. Okay, the writer reminded them that Jesus understands what it's like to have a close friend turn their back on you, or to feel like everyone hates you. He understands what it's like to lose someone that you love, to be tempted to do what you know is wrong, and to be rejected. Those verses in Hebrews told the early followers of Jesus, and they're telling us too, to hang on. Remember that Jesus knows what it's like to suffer, and to know that Jesus is with us in whatever difficulty we face. Okay, we've already said that comfort matters more when it comes from somebody who understands what we're going through. Now, if that's true, then Jesus can understand comfort better than any of us, because he understands suffer better than anyone. When life gets hard, One of the reasons we can hold firmly to Jesus is because he understands exactly what we're going through. He's with us every step of the way. So is it worth it? Well, when Jesus stared death, torture, and humiliation in the face, he decided, yes, you were worth it. And if following Jesus ever gets hard or exhausting, and it might, the book of Hebrews would say that yes, Jesus is worth it too. Okay, life isn't easy. Following Jesus is not always easy. There might be days when you want to give up, but on those days, I hope that you remember that God is with you and he understands you, because the Jesus who suffered suffers with you. Okay, so what does God want us to do about all this? All right, well, coming up pretty soon is Good Friday. And if you remember, Good Friday is about Jesus' suffering. Right? It's the day that we remember the suffering that Jesus endured on our behalf. It's a day of grief, but it can also be a day of comfort if we remember that we are loved by a God who does not just understand us in theory, but also in experience. It doesn't matter how extreme your suffering is or isn't. Okay, Jesus understands, whether it's a tough class, a difficult relationship, or something much more painful. Jesus understands. When life gets hard, there are 3 ways that Good Friday reminds me that Jesus understands me. First of all, Good Friday reminds me that we are not alone. Because Jesus suffered so deeply, there is no suffering that we can face that he does not understand. Secondly, Good Friday reminds us that we can go to God with our sufferings. No matter how big or small your suffering is, we can go to God with boldness, right? We can tell God what happened, how we feel, and what questions we have. And thirdly, Good Friday reminds us to comfort others. When we reflect on the way that Jesus suffered, it should make us more compassionate and concerned about the suffering of others. Good Friday should be a time when you ask God to help you be a comfort to those around you who are hurting. I admit that sometimes feeling and experiencing pain and suffering can make us feel far from God. But what if we decided to see pain and suffering as a way to get closer to God? What if everything we face is an opportunity to know Jesus better? Right now, are you disappointed, stressed out, lonely, afraid? There's lots going on in our lives right now, lots of things that are different. Jesus knows what that's like. Okay, and what if instead of asking, God, why did you let this happen to me, you asked, Jesus, when did you feel this way? As we close, I encourage you to find and listen to the song Wounded Healer. And as you're listening to that song, spend a few minutes thanking Jesus for the suffering he endured on our behalf. Thank him for deciding that you were worth it, all the pain, death, and suffering. And take some time to tell Jesus about the ways that you're suffering and ask him to help you know him more through the pain that you both understand. Ask him how you can help others in the middle of their suffering. How can you help them feel less alone in their pain? I want you to remember that we cannot always avoid pain, but there is a real person who understands. Jesus knows how you feel, and his heart breaks when your heart is breaking. Okay, sometimes there is no greater comfort in the midst of pain than to know that somebody else gets it. So isn't it incredible to know that the Jesus who suffered suffers with you? That is truly good news. Peace to you, my friends. Be real.